In medieval Europe, marriage was not only about love. In many cases, it was about property, power, and family honor. A woman's body was seen as part of her husband's honor. Her actions could raise his status or destroy it. This belief shaped many laws and punishments of that time. To understand the punishments for cheating wives, we must first understand how people in medieval Europe saw marriage. Marriage was often arranged. Families chose partners to protect land, wealth, and alliances. Love was not always the main reason. A wife was expected to be loyal, obedient, and pure. Her main duty was to give her husband legitimate children. These children would inherit land and titles. If a wife committed adultery, it created fear. The biggest fear was about inheritance. If a woman had a child from another man, the husband might raise a child who was not truly his. That could break family lines and cause fights over property. So adultery was not only seen as a personal betrayal, it was seen as a threat to the whole social order. In medieval times, society was controlled by strict rules. The church and the state worked closely together. The church taught that adultery was a grave sin. It was not just a crime against a husband, it was a crime against God. The Bible strongly condemned adultery. Many people believed that God would punish entire communities if they allowed sin to spread. Because of this belief, laws became harsh. But it is important to notice something very clear. Men and women were not treated the same. A husband who cheated was often forgiven more easily. In many places, his actions were seen as weakness, not a crime. But a wife who cheated faced severe consequences. This double standard was deeply rooted in the idea that women were responsible for purity. In feudal society, power belonged mostly to men. Kings ruled kingdoms. Lords controlled land. Husbands controlled households. A wife was legally under her husband's authority. In some regions, she could not own property independently. She could not make important legal decisions without male approval. Because of this imbalance, when a wife was accused of adultery, she had little protection. Even an accusation could damage her reputation forever. Sometimes proof was weak. Sometimes it was based on gossip. But gossip was powerful in small medieval towns and villages. Everyone knew each other. Rumors spread quickly. Once accused, a woman could be brought before a local court. There were two main types of courts. Secular courts were run by local lords or kings. Church courts were run by bishops and priests. Both could deal with adultery cases, depending on the region and situation. Church courts focused on sin and repentance. They wanted confession. They wanted the sinner to admit guilt and promise to change. But secular courts often focused on punishment and public order. They wanted to send a message to others. Even before formal punishment, the social punishment began. A woman suspected of adultery could be isolated. Neighbors might stop talking to her. She might not be allowed to attend certain gatherings. In extreme cases, even her own family could reject her to protect their honor. Honor was everything in medieval Europe. For noble families, honor meant political power. For peasants, honor meant survival in a tight community. A damaged reputation could destroy marriage chances for daughters and business relations for sons. Many husbands reacted with anger and violence. In some areas, a husband had the right to physically punish his wife. If he caught her in adultery, he might beat her severely. In rare cases, he could even kill her and claim it was a crime of passion. Courts sometimes showed mercy to such husbands, but not all cases were violent. Sometimes families tried to solve the issue quietly. They might send the woman to a convent. Becoming a nun could remove the shame from public view. It was not always voluntary. For some women, it was forced isolation for life. In noble families, adultery could lead to divorce or annulment. However, divorce was difficult in Catholic Europe. The church did not easily allow it. Instead, couples might separate without officially ending the marriage. The woman would lose social status and financial support. For lower-class women, life was even harder. A peasant woman accused of adultery could lose her home. If her husband rejected her, she had few options. Work opportunities for women were limited. Survival could become almost impossible. These harsh realities created fear. Women were raised from childhood to guard their behavior. They were taught to avoid being alone with men. They were taught to dress modestly. Even smiling too much at another man could create suspicion. But it is important to understand something deeper. Not every accusation was true. Sometimes women were targeted because of jealousy, property disputes, or revenge. In a world without modern evidence systems, proving innocence was difficult. Trials often depended on witness testimony. If neighbors claimed they saw suspicious behavior, that might be enough. In some cases, trial by ordeal was used in earlier medieval periods. This meant the accused had to go through a painful physical test. People believed God would protect the innocent. If she survived without injury, she was innocent. If she was harmed, it was seen as proof of guilt. Although trial by ordeal became less common later, the belief in divine judgment remained strong. People believed God watched every action. Fear of eternal punishment was as strong as fear of earthly punishment. As medieval Europe developed, laws became more structured. Written legal codes described penalties for adultery. These penalties varied from region to region. Some areas imposed fines. Others required public humiliation. Some allowed severe physical punishment. What made these punishments especially harsh for women was the connection between sexuality and control. A woman's body was seen as something that must be guarded. Her loyalty symbolized family stability. When she stepped outside that control, society reacted strongly. In many ways, these punishments were not only about justice, they were about maintaining order. They sent a message. Loyalty must be preserved at all costs. Yet behind these laws were real human stories. Some women may have sought love in unhappy marriages. Some were forced into marriages at a very young age. Some were abused and looked for comfort elsewhere. But medieval law rarely considered emotional reasons. It focused on rules, not feelings. As we move forward, we will see how punishments became more visible and more public. Society did not just want to punish the body. It wanted to shame the soul. Public humiliation became one of the strongest tools used against accused wives. In the next part, we will explore how towns gathered to watch these punishments. We will see how shame was used as a weapon, and we will understand why public spectacle was so important in medieval justice. The story of medieval punishments is not only about cruelty. It is about fear, control, power, and belief. It reveals how deeply gender roles shaped the lives of women. It shows how law and religion worked together to protect a system built on male authority. And this is only the beginning. In medieval Europe, punishment was not always private. In fact, very often it was public. Justice was something people were meant to see. It was meant to be remembered. It was meant to create fear. When a wife was accused of adultery, the goal was not only to correct her behavior. The goal was to warn every other woman in the town. Public shame was one of the strongest weapons used against women accused of cheating. In small villages and crowded towns, reputation was everything. When that reputation was destroyed in front of everyone, it could never fully return. One common punishment is public confession. A woman found guilty in a church court might be ordered to stand in front of the church during Sunday service. She would wear simple clothing, sometimes barefoot, sometimes holding a candle. The priest would announce her sin. She would be required to confess and ask for forgiveness in front of neighbors, friends, and even children. Imagine the silence of the crowd. Imagine the eyes watching her. In a society where honor meant survival, this moment could be worse than physical pain. The humiliation stayed with her long after the ceremony ended. Another common tool of public shame was the pillory. The pillory was a wooden structure with holes for the head and hands. The accused would stand locked inside it in a busy public space, often in the town square. People walking by could shout insults. Some might throw rotten food, mud, or stones. The purpose was not only punishment, it was humiliation. Sometimes, the stocks were used instead. The stocks were similar but usually held the feet instead of the hands. The woman would sit on the ground, unably, to move, while the public mocked her. Children learned from these scenes. They learned what happened to those who broke social rules. In some regions, women accused of sexual misconduct were forced to wear special clothing. They might wear a rough garment or a sign describing their crime. This marked them as sinners even after the official punishment ended. It was a way to extend shame beyond one day. There was also a device called the scold's bridle in certain parts of Europe. Though it was often used for women accused of gossiping or speaking too much, it could also be used against women accused of immoral behavior. It was a metal mask placed over the head. Some versions had a piece that pressed on the tongue to prevent speaking. Being paraded through town wearing such a device was deeply humiliating. One of the most famous punishments associated with women was the ducking stool. This was used especially in England and parts of Germany. The woman would be tied to a chair, attached to a long wooden beam. She would be lowered into a river or pond and pulled back up repeatedly. Crowds would gather to watch. Though it was more often used for so-called disorderly women, it could also be used to punish those accused of sexual wrongdoing. The message was clear. Society controlled women's bodies and behavior. If a woman stepped outside expected limits, her body became a public object of punishment. But humiliation did not stop at physical display. Songs and stories were sometimes created about scandals. In tight communities, people talked. A single rumor could grow larger than truth. Even after punishment, whispers followed the woman everywhere. In noble families, public humiliation took different forms. The scandal could spread through letters and political enemies. A noble woman accused of adultery could lose alliances. Her family name could be damaged. In some cases, she might be sent away quietly to avoid open disgrace. But the shame still existed behind closed doors. It is important to understand that many accusations were not based on strong proof. Suspicion could grow from small actions. If a woman spoke privately with a man too often, people noticed. If she dressed slightly differently, rumors began. Jealousy could also play a role. A rejected man might spread false claims. A rival family might use accusation as a weapon. Because of this, fear shaped daily life. Women were expected to move carefully, speak carefully, and avoid any situation that could create doubt. Even innocent behavior could be misunderstood. Public punishment also served another purpose. It reinforced male authority. When a husband stood by as his wife was humiliated, it showed his power over her. It showed that he had control restored. In some cases, husbands themselves demanded punishment to clear their own honor. There were times when a husband forgave his wife. In such cases, he might request lighter punishment from the court. But forgiveness was complicated. Even if he forgave her privately, society might not. His reputation depended on appearing strong and honorable. The church often required acts of repentance after punishment. A woman might be ordered to fast for a period of time. She might be required to give money to the poor. She might be told to make a pilgrimage to a holy site. These acts were meant to cleanse the soul, but they also reminded her of her status as a sinner. Public shame worked because medieval society was deeply connected. People depended on one another for survival. Farmers needed neighbors to share tools and labor. Merchants needed customers. Families needed marriage alliances. When someone was publicly shamed, these connections weakened. Over time, repeated public punishments created a culture of fear. Women saw what happened to others and adjusted their behavior. Mothers warned daughters about the dangers of reputation. Stories were told not only as history but as warnings. Yet beneath this harsh system, human emotions still existed. Love, loneliness, anger, and desire did not disappear simply because laws were strict. Some women risked everything for relationships. Others may have been falsely accused because of political or personal conflicts. The crowd that gathered to watch punishment was not always kind, but not everyone in that crowd was cruel. Some may have felt pity. Some may have doubted the fairness of the accusation. However, few dared to speak against the system openly. To question punishment was to question authority. Public humiliation created scars that lasted for life. A woman might remain married after punishment, but trust was broken. Her children might face teasing. Her family might struggle to arrange future marriages. In manuales, shame was stronger than prison. Medieval prisons were not like modern ones. Long-term imprisonment was rare. Instead, justice focused on visible punishment and social consequences. Once shame entered a person's life, it followed them daily. As time passed, some regions slowly changed their laws, but during much of the medieval period, public humiliation remained common. It was cheaper than imprisonment. It was faster than long trials. And it served as a dramatic warning. However, public shame was only one side of the story. In some places and periods, punishments went beyond humiliation. Physical pain and even death could become part of the system. In the next part, we will look at the darker side of medieval justice. We will explore the physical punishments and harsh treatments that some women faced after being accused of adultery. We will see how fear of disorder led to cruelty, and how power shaped the limits of mercy. As medieval justice moved beyond shame and humiliation, punishment sometimes became physical. In certain regions and periods, authorities believed that pain could correct sin. The body was punished so that the soul might be purified, and society might feel protected from disorder. It is important to remember that medieval Europe did not have one single legal system. Laws changed from kingdom to kingdom and even from town to town. Some places were more lenient, while others were extremely harsh. But across many regions, adultery, especially when committed by a married woman, could lead to severe physical punishment. One common punishment was public whipping. A woman found guilty might be tied to a post or forced to walk through town while being whipped. The goal was not only pain, but visibility. People watched as punishment happened, reinforcing the lesson that moral rules had consequences. Whipping often took place near markets or church squares where crowds gathered naturally. The sound of the whip echoed through the streets. For the woman, the physical pain ended eventually, but the memory remained. Scars on the body became permanent reminders. Branding was another punishment used in some areas. A heated metal mark could be pressed onto the skin, sometimes on the shoulder or arm. This mark identified the person as someone guilty of moral crime. It turned punishment into lifelong identification. Even if she moved to another town, the mark told a story she could not hide. Haircutting was also used as punishment. In medieval culture, a woman's hair symbolized femininity and honor. Cutting it publicly was meant to remove dignity. Sometimes the head was shaved completely while crowds watched. The act carried deep symbolic meaning, a stripping away of status and beauty. In extreme cases, women accused of adultery could be imprisoned for short periods. Medieval prisons were harsh places. They were dark, crowded, and unhealthy. Food was limited, and disease spread. Prison was not meant for long-term reform, but for temporary suffering before another punishment or judgment. There were also cases where torture was used during investigations. Torture was not applied everywhere, but in some late medieval courts, it became part of legal procedure. Authorities believed that pain forced truth from the accused. If evidence was weak, confession under torture could be accepted as proof. Methods varied. Some involved stretching the body, others involved sleep deprivation or binding limbs tightly. The goal was to create fear strong enough to produce confession. Many people confessed simply to end suffering, whether guilty or innocent. For women accused of adultery, torture created terrible pressure. Without modern legal protections, resisting accusation was extremely difficult. A confession, once given, almost always led to punishment. In some regions, influenced by older customs, husbands were allowed to carry out personal revenge under certain conditions. If a husband caught his wife and her lover together, local law might reduce punishment for violence committed in anger. Courts sometimes viewed this as defense of honor rather than murder. This reveals how deeply honor shaped justice. A husband's reputation mattered greatly. Society often sympathized with his anger more than with the woman's situation. Execution for adultery was rare, but not unheard of. In certain times and places, especially where religious law strongly influenced secular authority, death penalties existed. Methods could include burning, drowning, or execution by sword. Such cases were uncommon but powerful in shaping fear. Drowning punishments appeared in some regional traditions. A woman accused of serious moral crime might be tied and thrown into water. Survival was sometimes interpreted as divine judgment. These practices reflected older beliefs, mixing religion and superstition. However, many punishments stopped short of death because communities still depended on labor and stability. Killing too many people weakened society. Therefore, authorities often preferred punishments that controlled behavior without removing individuals completely. Another harsh outcome was exile. A woman could be forced to leave her town permanently. Exile meant losing home, family, and protection. In a world without modern travel systems, survival alone was extremely difficult. Many exiled women became wonders, or depended on charity. Exile also protected community reputation. By removing the accused person, the town symbolically removed sin from its boundaries. The physical punishments revealed something important about medieval thinking. Crime was seen not only as personal wrongdoing, but as spiritual danger. People believed sin could bring divine punishment upon an entire community. Famine, disease, or war. Punishing the sinner protected everyone else. Fear of God played a major role. Sermons described hell vividly. Priests warned that immoral behavior could lead to eternal suffering. These teachings made earthly punishment seem necessary and even merciful compared to divine judgment. Yet behind these punishments were complicated human realities. Some marriages were unhappy or forced. Young women were sometimes married to much older men for political or economic reasons. Emotional needs were rarely considered by law. There were also false accusations driven by revenge. Property disputes between families could turn into moral accusations. A woman without strong family protection was especially vulnerable. Widows or outsiders often faced higher risk because fewer people defended them. Not every authority supported extreme punishment. Some judges and priests showed mercy. Records exist of reduced penalties when repentance seemed sincere. In certain cases, couples reconciled after mediation by church officials. Still, mercy depended heavily on social status. Noble women sometimes avoided harsh punishment because of family influence. Poor women rarely had such protection. Justice was not equal. Over time, repeated harsh punishments shaped behavior deeply. Women learned to guard their reputations carefully. Social rules became internalized. Fear controlled choices long before courts became involved. But punishment also revealed anxiety within medieval society itself. Rapid changes, wars, plagues, and economic struggles created uncertainty. Controlling morality became a way to create order in a chaotic world. By punishing adultery publicly and physically, authorities sent a message that stability still existed. Rules still mattered. God's order still stood. Yet these punishments also exposed the imbalance between men and women. A husband's infidelity rarely produced the same level of violence or humiliation. Society judged female sexuality far more strictly because inheritance and honor were tied to it. As the medieval period moved toward later centuries, church courts began playing an even stronger role in moral cases. Confession, repentance, and spiritual judgment became central parts of trials. In the next part, we'll explore how church courts questioned accused women, how confession shaped outcomes, and how religious authority reinforced and sometimes softened punishment. As we move deeper into medieval justice, we see that not all punishment came from whips or public squares. Much of it came from inside churches and courtrooms, where religion shaped the meaning of guilt. Church courts played a powerful role in cases of adultery, especially when the issue was seen as a sin rather than simply a social crime. In medieval Europe, the church was not separate from daily life. It guided marriage, birth, death, and law. Marriage itself was considered a sacred bond made before God. Because of this, breaking that bond was more than betrayal of a husband. It was betrayal of a holy promise. When a woman was accused of adultery, she might be called before a church court led by a bishop or a church official. These courts focused on confession and repentance. Their goal was not always physical punishment. Instead, they wanted the sinner to admit guilt and seek forgiveness. The trial process could feel intimidating. The accused woman stood before religious authorities who asked direct questions about her actions. Witnesses might speak against her. Neighbors could describe what they believed they saw. Private behavior became public discussion. Confession was central. Medieval Christianity placed great importance on admitting sin. If a woman confessed willingly, she might receive a lighter punishment. The church believed that true repentance could restore the soul. However, confession also meant public acknowledgement of wrongdoing, which damaged reputation deeply. If she denied the accusation, the process could become more serious. Evidence was often based on testimony rather than physical proof. 2 or 3 witnesses claiming suspicious behavior could be enough to build a case. In some situations, character mattered more than facts. If a woman already had a reputation for being too friendly or independent, suspicion increased. Church courts often required acts of penance. Penance could include fasting for weeks, praying specific prayers daily, giving money to the poor, or going on pilgrimage to a holy site. Pilgrimage was difficult and expensive. It meant leaving home and traveling long distances, sometimes in dangerous conditions. These punishments were meant to heal the soul, but they also reinforced control. The woman's daily life became shaped by her status as a sinner. Even after completing penance, full trust rarely returned. One important part of church involvement was marriage law. The church controlled annulments and separations. If adultery was proven, a husband could request separation. However, Divorce in the modern sense did not exist in most Catholic regions. The marriage bond remained spiritually intact. This created complex situations. A separated wife might live apart, but could not remarry. She often depended on family support or limited property rights. Financial survival became uncertain. At the same time, the Church also preached forgiveness. Some priests encouraged reconciliation. They urged husbands to forgive repentant wives. In certain cases, mediation helped restore marriages, but forgiveness depended heavily on social pressure and the husband's willingness. The Church's role reveals a contradiction. On one side, it taught mercy and redemption. On the other side, it supported a system that judged women more strictly than men. Double standards were deeply rooted. A husband's affair was often ignored, unless it caused public scandal. His actions were seen as moral weakness, not social disaster. But a wife's affair threatened inheritance and family honor. Therefore, her punishment was often harsher. This imbalance reflected broader gender roles. Medieval society believed men were naturally more tempted by desire. Women were expected to be guardians of morality. They were seen as responsible for controlling not only themselves, but also protecting men from sin. Religious teachings sometimes portrayed women as morally weaker, referencing biblical stories like Eve in the Garden of Eden. These ideas influenced how guilt was interpreted. If a woman sinned, it confirmed existing beliefs about female weakness. Yet not all church leaders were equally harsh. Some legal records show compassion. In certain cases, if a woman could prove she was forced into adultery or abused, punishment was reduced. However, proving force was extremely difficult. Without strong witnesses, her claim might not be believed. Another important factor was social class. Noble women often faced political consequences rather than physical punishment. Their cases were handled quietly to avoid public scandal. Meanwhile, poor women experienced more visible penalties. Church courts also handled accusations made out of jealousy or revenge. Sometimes false claims were exposed. In such cases, the accuser could face punishment for slander. However, clearing one's name fully was challenging. Suspicion often lingered. The role of confession shaped medieval thinking deeply. Confession meant not only admitting actions, but accepting authority. By confessing, the accused recognized the Church's power over her moral life. This reinforced religious control within society. In addition, public penance ceremonies often took place inside churches. The woman might kneel during Mass while the priest announced her offense. The community witnessed her repentance. This ritual strengthened the connection between religion and social discipline. Over time, church courts developed written records. These documents reveal the complexity of cases. Not every story was simple betrayal. Some involved forced marriages, domestic violence, or long separations caused by war. But the law rarely addressed emotional suffering directly. The Church also feared scandal. Too many open cases of adultery could damage the image of moral order. Therefore, some cases were handled quietly through private confession and smaller penances. Despite religious focus on forgiveness, fear remained powerful. People believed sin could lead to eternal punishment in hell. Earthly suffering was sometimes described as mercy compared to divine judgment. As medieval Europe moved toward the late period, legal systems slowly evolved. Secular courts began separating more clearly from church courts. However, religious influence on morality remained strong for centuries. The story of church trials shows how deeply belief shaped justice. Punishment was not only about law. It was about protecting a spiritual worldview where marriage symbolized divine order. Yet beneath theology were real human lives. Women carried the weight of family honor, religious expectation, and legal vulnerability. Some found mercy. Many did not. In the final part, we will step back and examine why these harsh punishments existed at all. We will explore what they reveal about fear, power, gender roles, and the structure of medieval society itself. Because to understand the brutality, we must understand the world that created it. As we reach the final part of this story, we must step back and ask a deeper question. Why were punishments for cheating wives in medieval Europe so harsh? Why did society react with such fear, anger, and public cruelty? The answer is not simple. It is connected to power, religion, property, and survival. Medieval Europe was not a stable or comfortable world. Life was fragile. Wars were common. Disease could wipe out entire villages. Famine could appear after one bad harvest. In such a world, order felt precious and icily broken. People believed strong rules were necessary to keep society from collapsing. Marriage was one of the foundations of that order. It created alliances between families. It protected property. It produced children who would continue family lines. When a wife committed adultery, people believed this foundation was shaken. The fear was not only about love or betrayal. It was about inheritance. Land was wealth. Titles meant power. If a child was not truly the husband's, property could pass to the wrong bloodline. This could cause conflict between families and even violence. So, society reacted strongly to protect lineage. Another reason was patriarchy. Medieval society was built around male authority. Kings ruled kingdoms. Lords ruled lands. Fathers ruled households. A wife was legally and socially under her husband's control. When she stepped outside that control, it was seen as rebellion against the natural order. Punishment reinforced male dominance. It reminded everyone who held power. Public humiliation, whipping, or forced confession were not only about correcting behavior. They were about restoring authority. Religion also played a powerful role. The church taught that adultery was a serious sin. Sin was not private. It affected the whole community. People believed that God might punish an entire town for allowing immoral behavior to spread. Drought, plague, or invasion could be seen as divine anger. Because of this belief, punishing sin felt necessary for survival. Authorities believed they were protecting not only law, but also God's favor. At the same time, double standards revealed deeper inequality. A husband's infidelity rarely created the same level of fear, because inheritance flowed through the male line. A man having relations outside marriage did not threaten the certainty of his children's identity in the same way. So, society judged women more harshly. This shows how women's bodies were tied directly to property and power. Their personal choices were rarely seen as personal. They were viewed as social risks. It is also important to remember that not every community applied extreme punishment. Some regions were more moderate. Some couples resolved issues privately, but the threat of harsh punishment always existed in the background, shaping behavior. Over time, Europe slowly changed. Economic growth, stronger centralized governments, and new ideas about individual rights began to reshape laws. By the early modern period, punishments in many places became less brutal. Public executions for adultery became rare. Church courts gradually lost some power, yet the cultural memory of strict control over women's sexuality lasted much longer. Even when laws softened, social judgment remained strong. When we study these punishments today, it is easy to see only cruelty. And there was cruelty, but there was also fear. Fear of disorder, fear of losing property, fear of divine anger. Medieval people believed harsh justice protected their world. Still, we must recognize the human cost. Women accused of adultery faced public shame, physical pain, and lifelong stigma. Some were guilty by modern standards. Others were victims of false accusation, jealousy, or political conflict. Behind every record in a court book was a real person with emotions, hopes, and fears. Some may have sought love in unhappy marriages arranged for money or alliance. Some may have been abused. Some may have simply been targeted because they were vulnerable. History reminds us that justice systems reflect the values of their time. Medieval justice valued order over personal freedom. It valued male authority over gender equality. It valued public example over private dignity. By examining these punishments, we do more than study cruelty. We learn how power works. We see how fear can shape law. We understand how gender roles were enforced not only through culture but through physical force. It also invites reflection on progress. Modern legal systems in many parts of the world now treat adultery as a private matter rather than a crime. Women have legal rights to property, divorce, and protection from violence. These rights were not always present. They developed slowly over centuries. Yet the past still echoes. Ideas about honor, shame, and control did not disappear overnight. Understanding medieval punishment helps us understand how deeply rooted some attitudes can be. The brutal reality of medieval justice shows a society trying to defend its structure in a world filled with danger, but it also shows how easily power can be used to silence and harm those with less protection. In the end, the story of these punishments is not only about cheating wives. It is about how societies define morality. It is about who has authority to judge. It is about whose voices are heard and whose are ignored. Medieval Europe believed it was protecting stability and divine order. But in doing so, it often sacrificed compassion and fairness. History does not change the past, but it teaches us to look carefully at the systems we build today. It reminds us that laws should protect people, not simply preserve power. And perhaps the most important lesson is this: whenever fear and inequality guide justice, suffering follows. This concludes the full script.